Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 140. Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards. I've been wanting to do this podcast for a long time, talking about communicating chiropractic in a contemporary model. And there's all kinds of people that really deserve a shout out for the science behind the way that we think about chiropractic today. And specifically, we think about the spine and the nervous system, all the way back to Christopher Kent, Patrick Gentempo, even David Seaman. Fast forward with James Chestnut and John Minardi and Haavik and Dan Murphy. And I'm sure I'm missing other people along that path, but shout out to them for starting to really formulate how we look at chiropractic today from a scientific model. My role in this process is to take that information and assimilate it into a way to communicate to people. And one thing I'm actually going to be doing later this week is a webinar. I'll put the link in here, guys, and you can see it in the show notes. I'm going to talk about the retention myths, and a lot of that is built around communicating chiropractic and how to communicate chiropractic. So if you want to check that out, please jump in and register, and we'll see you later this week. Or if you're not going to be able to make it, then you can catch the replay. That said, this is a concept that's been on my mind probably for years, and I was speaking to my associate doctor, and we were, really formulating how we want to communicate chiropractic. And we use something called the communication tool, which is really just an Excel document where we database and store all the different communication strategies that we use with our patients in our practice. And this computer analogy, if you will, has been used over and over and over again, and I've been developing it over time, and it really solves a lot of the challenges that exist, I find, with communicating chiropractic. And I'll talk as well about when you would have this conversation with somebody, when you wouldn't have this conversation. It's not going to be for everybody, but it is a great place and a standard, I believe, to bring people towards. And if they can understand more about what we do in this way and in this model, it's going to make what you do a lot easier, and they'll understand it, and they'll have a lot less questions and more and a deeper understanding of what you do and why they see you on a consistent basis. So it really was born out of this idea of the original concepts, Chris Kent, disafferentation, David Seaman, and even James Chestnut talking about it in his book, the 14, foundational principles or fundamental principles, and highlighting that the bone on nerve and bone pressing on a nerve model is not only outdated, but not a very good descriptor of how it is that we can impact people. And of course, as I said, that's been progressed even further at Haavik's lab, looking at the effect on chiropractic care and brain function, really, and some amazing things that are coming out there. And really reinforcing this model of neurological health, improved movement and motion of the spinal system, and how that plays a role. So how do we get our patients to understand that? I would say this is not necessarily, in many cases, a day one to day two conversation, at least not in the depth that I'm going to cover it today. It's not something that's necessary for somebody to understand in order to make the decision and to come up with a win-win agreement to move forward and to start care in your practice. But it is something that I want people to understand as time progresses and time moves on, because it does solve that problem of, if we're making these adjustments or these corrections, why are they not holding? If I'm coming so often, why am I not getting better in terms of, especially, why do we always need to adjust me, or why is it the same adjustments? I think that's an important premise to be able to have your patients understand, so they see the value in long-term care and why. And this idea that when we're doing our care, delivering either a correction or adjustment or whatever your terminology happens to be, that it's in some ways disconnected from the subjective side of things, and that's okay. And I know for a lot of people, they've been taught that you have to connect subluxation to the person's subjective experience, otherwise they're not going to either understand why they're seeing you, or they're not going to continue seeing you. And of course, the slippery slope here is that if they subjectively feel better, then there's a chance that they assume that the problem is solved. If they subjectively feel worse, then somehow you did a disservice to them, or your chiropractic care didn't work. If we can detach them from that, then they can truly understand that they're coming to see us to care for the spinal nervous system, and that problems that we find with the spinal nervous system, aka subluxation, has an effect on their body, has an effect on the nervous system, on the mechanics, and it affects them in ways that they feel, but also affects them in all kinds of ways that they have no idea about. And so if you think about the testing you do, and hopefully you do testing, in our practice, we use a handful of different tests, from electromyography to thermography to stress adaptability to bilateral weight differential, structural radiographs. There's 15 or 16 different tests that we use at the beginning phase of care and at the end of the first phase to remeasure and test and compare to. Those tests are not necessarily one-to-one indicators of the effects of subluxation. They are also not measurements of subluxation, meaning this is where you need a correction or this is where you need an adjustment. I know a lot of people look at the EMG as an example and say, well, why are you adjusting me on the left when it shows that there's colors on the right? And so if you take a step back and you think about this, the body is a self-healing, self-regulating organism. As we know, it's really a core, fundamental piece of our philosophy. It's really part of our value system, and it's true on top of all that. And so when we work with somebody, these objective tests we're taking are truly focused on the analytics of the system. And I love this idea of a computer system. So if you look at your computer, as amazing as it is, the system is operational. There's an operating system inside, and then there's the mechanics on the outside. So you have the keyboard and the other hardware type components. When something's going wrong with the computer, we don't necessarily, as the user, step in and unscrew it and look in the back and try and figure out the inner workings of it, although some people probably know enough to do that. I sure don't. But there's something to be said about understanding the code that needs to be uncovered in order to reboot or reset. Now, sometimes it's as simple as hitting the start button, and there's a reset and a recalibration process that happens that's built into the computer system. And then, of course, sometimes you need a more complicated code, and not to say that Control-Alt-Delete is complicated, but you get my idea, that there's a mechanical component to resetting things. And so when we're taking the tests are really about the analytics. So if we're looking at the EMG or thermography or stress adaptability, even structural radiographs, depending on what model you're using and what technique you're using, for the most part, they're not telling me where to make a correction. What they're telling me is, what's happening to the body. Some of that may be subluxation related, some of it may not be. But it's an analytical assessment that I can come back to after a series of recalibrations. So either hitting the reset button or Control-Alt-Delete or some other complicated code that we would need to uncover or detect through the computer system. And we would enter that a series of times, and then we'd retest the analytics. That's essentially what we're doing as chiropractors, is we're uncovering a code. So our analysis, we're delivering some kind of mechanical input that literally translates into information. And that information allows for a reset or a clean slate. And then the analytics should show that there's improvement. Now we know that Control-Alt-Delete or hitting reset or whatever other code we enter is not always going to fix every component of the analytics, but it's always a good starting point. How many times when your computer freezes, or if you're having computer problems or internet problems, don't tell me you don't just restart the computer or restart the router or reset your phone. It's the same type of process. And to be able to communicate that to our patients, that look, I understand you have all of these symptoms, that this is your subjective experience, this is what's going on with you. Here's what the analytics are telling us. They're telling us your system is not operating at full capacity. I've got a code that I'm going to be able to use, and I'll input that code or I'll hit the reset button, and your body will be able to recalibrate. Some of the subjective output or the analytics is going to change. And even there's a separation between analytics and subjective output, but the analytics are going to change. And if the analytics change, you may recognize that the function of the computer system, or in the case of the body, the analytics change, the EMG, thermography, structural radiographs, these change. And there's improvements or alterations of the subjective output. But at the end of the day, recalibrating the system is always good. And that's really what it comes down to, especially in this third model, paradigm model of chiropractic that we've really been talking about now for over 10 years, is that you're just better off not subluxated. And we can't predict the analytical output all the time, although we know that they're better off. Sometimes it's complicated and confusing, and the body's in the process of flux and change and adaptation. So to always just rely on the testing to say, oh, well, you're better or worse, versus you're in the process of change, you're adapting, let's see what it looks like in 3 months or 6 months. And again, focusing more on the fact that we have a code that we can enter, we have a recalibration or reset process that we can use that creates a clean slate or a recalibration or an alteration of the operating system or the way the operating system works or interprets information. And then the body has different outcomes. And what that does is it detaches what you do. What we do is always good. You are always better off not subluxated. You are always better off without mechanical distortion in the spine. Whatever your language is, whatever your lexicon is, if you tie yourself to the subjective outcomes and even tie yourself to the objective outcomes entirely, then you've created a slippery slope. You've created a situation that it's going to be difficult to win all the time. If you've tied yourself to the fact that, let's use another example. Exercise is good. Movement is good. Water is good. Now, there's a point where some of those things may be toxic or excessive, but those ranges are at the very, very, very far end. So as long as you have an analysis and a directive in terms of where you're going to apply force, where you're going to hit the reset button, and some way to test and retest to know that what you're doing is having an impact, then you can go back and check the analytics over and over and over again. So as I said, it's a really interesting concept. It's one I want all my patients to understand. It takes the disafferentation model and turns it into something that hopefully patients can really wrap their head around and get. And there's a lot of times where you'll have this conversation, maybe not day 1, 2, but definitely in a curriculum. And if you don't know what the curriculum is, you can go back and find a podcast that talks about the curriculum. But definitely in a curriculum, an email curriculum, a video-based curriculum, definitely at future re-examinations and new agreements that you're making, ongoing emails, video series, workshops. These are things, and definitely Table Talk is a place where I'm going to have this conversation regularly, especially when people are bringing up symptoms. And then, people assume because we have a really strong retention-based practice, and here I'm talking about this third paradigm model that people never talk about symptoms. They do. I just have a strategy to move them away from their symptom as the sole focus and to really reinforce why they're in our practice and how we can help them. And they know that we can reboot the system, recalibrate the system by entering our code, and that takes a specific specialty in order to do that. And so I know that if you think through this and really get to the point where you can verbalize it, write about it, and share this with your patient base and practice and start to move them towards this understanding, you're going to see some freedom in your practice. You're going to see people really understand what it is you're trying to do, and you're going to stop having those same conversations over and over and over again, the ones that are painful and they make practice challenging and difficult. And it can just be fun and free because people understand why they're there, they understand what your purpose is, and there's an agreement between the two. So guys, I'd love to see you on the webinar this week. You can find that in the show notes and you can register. It's free. It only has 100 spots, so if you do register and you don't get on, we'll send you a replay. And guys, thank you for listening to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic.